Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Live with NORML. I'm JM Pedini, the Development Director for the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. It's Friday, November 15th, 2024. You know what that means, friends. Today we're going to answer all of your burning questions live, and I'm going to be joined in just a little bit by NORML's Deputy Director, Paul Armentano, and together we're going to discuss the potential impacts of the 2024 election results on state and federal cannabis policies, including the rescheduling effort that's already underway. We heard a lot of things about cannabis and potential impacts at the federal level this week, and we're going to take a deep dive into that. Hey everyone, let's see who's here. Hey Nick, hey Brady, thanks for being here, friends. Hey everyone who has joined us on Instagram, thank you so much. Wherever you're watching, take a quick second to hit that like, follow, or subscribe button so you never miss when NORML goes live. We try to do this every week at 4 o'clock Eastern on Fridays. And I can see your comments on Instagram. I can see your comments everywhere else. I can't show your Instagram comments, but I promise I'll read them if you put them up in there for me. Hey, drop a note. Let me know where you are watching from. Thanks, Brady, for the questions. We are going to talk about that. It's on the list, I swear. Happy Friday, Fred. Nick, amazing. Nick's already called all of his local electeds to make sure they know cannabis policy is a big issue for him in Pennsylvania. I love that. Hey, Marco in Arizona. Hey, Fred. Hi, Kellyanne in Pittsburgh. Hello from Luxembourg. Hello to you in Luxembourg. Thanks for coming back. Glad to see you here again. Hey, a PhD in Florida. Good to see you. Florida kid here, myself. What if Indonesia wants to have a NORML chapter? Great, I love that. Just send us an email, send me an email at chapters@norml.org. You can find out all the information you need, and we'll get you started. It'll be great. How do I feel about descheduling? We're definitely going to talk about the rescheduling process, and we can talk about descheduling during that time as well. Though I can tell you NORML has been on the record for a very long time now calling for descheduling. Hey, John, thanks for joining us. All right, everyone. Hey, drop your comment in the question. I'm going to ask Paul to join us, so let's make that happen. I did it. Hi, Paul.
Hi, JM. Happy Friday.
Happy Friday to you. Does this look good? Maybe this looks better. Yeah, this looks a little better. All right. I love it.
Good with
it. Thank you. So let's just jump right into it, Paul. For those of you just joining us, we are going to talk about specifically the impact of the 2024 election results. At least at the beginning of the show, we can get into some other questions you might have toward the end of the show. But beginning, let us know if you have any questions about what these elections mean for the future of cannabis policy at the state and federal level. And Paul, we'll start off with this question for you. In an email to NORML members that went out earlier this week, you wrote, setbacks are inherent to political movements, but movements are defined by how advocates respond to them. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, absolutely. In short, we as a movement are certainly not going to be defined by a single election cycle, nor should we be. As most folks on the live stream know, I've been doing this work professionally for 3 decades. I've seen my share of election victories, and I've seen my share of election losses. But this has always been a long game. And I'm looking at our overall trajectory throughout the last 20 years. We've gone from no states where the adult use of marijuana is legal to now 24 states, or 180 million Americans now living in jurisdictions where you can legally possess and buy marijuana. I've seen us go from 0 states where medical marijuana is legally regulated to 38, potentially now 39 states where medical access is allowed. I've seen us go from having no states with marijuana specific expungement policies to now having 24 states where individuals who have past criminal convictions for marijuana can now have those convictions vacated. And over 2 million Americans have used those laws to have their criminal records vacated. So when I look at the big picture, I know that we are making significant political and cultural and legislative gains in this country, and we have been for decades. We've seen public support for legalization go from about 25% when I began doing this work to now close to 70% nationwide. So while certainly personally I was disappointed to see some of the state-specific results come out of last Tuesday night's election, in many ways I wasn't surprised. You know, South Dakota in 2022, South Dakota voters had rejected marijuana legalization.
Mhm.
In 2022, North Dakota voters had rejected marijuana legalization. So it was hardly a surprise that 2 years later they did it again. It wasn't much of a surprise that an initiative in Florida didn't get over 60% of the vote. Only 3 previous adult use legalization initiatives in any state had ever gotten over 60% of the vote, and none of them had to face a $50 million taxpayer-funded propaganda campaign opposing the initiative that was led by the state's very popular governor. So none of these things were surprising, and none of these results in any way reflect any sort of mandate with respect to where the American people generally stand on legalization. We already knew where they stood on legalization in North Dakota and South Dakota. We already knew it was unlikely 60% of voters plus 1 in Florida were going to approve this initiative. But it doesn't mean that we are not continuing to move this issue forward. At worst, coming out of election day, you could argue we were in the same place we were going into election day, where the majority of people in this country live in states where marijuana is legal. And frankly, we came out of election day in even a stronger position because we saw medical marijuana overwhelmingly approved by voters in Nebraska. We saw voters in the city of Dallas, 1.3 million people, approve a local initiative that will stop police from making low-level marijuana arrests. Again, in a city of 1.3 million people in Texas, they voted for that. To give you some perspective, if you combine the total population of North and South Dakota, it's barely more than 1.3 million people. So that Texas victory was a big deal. And we're going to continue to see those victories at the local and state level. And we're going to continue to see popular opinion move forward. And as much as some of our political opponents might be trying to take a victory lap this last week or so and talk big about how they've turned the tide, the fact is none of our political opponents have even dared to try to put a measure on the ballot in a legal marijuana state to try to repeal or roll back legalization or medical marijuana access. And the reason they don't dare do that is because they know it would lose.
Yeah, and to that point, 106 cities and counties in Kentucky had medical cannabis measures on the ballot, and every single one was approved. In Kentucky, a clean sweep as to whether or not they wanted cannabis businesses located in their municipalities. And they all said yes, and that is a resounding endorsement from the American public, from the Kentucky public.
Yeah, absolutely. To me, JM, one of the most important sort of takeaways when I look at data is looking at polls in states where marijuana is legal and has been legal and seeing what the public thinks about legalization when they're experiencing it in real time. And what we see in states like Colorado and California and others is that the longer legalization is in effect, the greater percentage of voters, a greater percentage of the public support legalization. In other words, the more familiar they become with legalization, the more comfortable they are with legalization, the more they like it. That, to me, is the strongest endorsement that these policies are creating net positives in their communities. If the sky was really falling, public support would be declining as more states come on board and legalize. Voters would have buyer's remorse and say, geez, I thought I supported legalization, but now that I've seen it up close, I don't like it. Just the opposite is happening and has been happening really for the last decade. The more people experience legalization firsthand, the more they like it. And the polls tell us that.
Not only are we seeing that in the polls, we're seeing that in state houses around the country. Once those legislators have had that direct real life exposure to regulated cannabis in their communities, they become more emotionally comfortable with it. And they're willing to consider other reforms related to cannabis policy that may be protecting the rights of responsible consumers or expanding access to the program. And it is voters. It is also legislators that can change their minds and become more emotionally comfortable with something once it is their reality, once they have that exposure.
Yeah, once we go from theoretical to practical, we see that shift. And you're correct. It's not just among the citizenry. We see it among lawmakers as well.
Yeah, and that's why, at least for me, that is why I so often recommend to people, listen, you're not getting everything out of those people you've elected. You'll be lucky to get any tiny bit of progress. And that's what you, if you're in a state where you don't have easy access to reform, that's where you need to put your eggs, in that basket, in the basket that just moves forward a little tiny bit. It's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be everything you want, because that is not on your menu. But if you can do something and you can build that emotional comfort with those lawmakers, let them get used to it. Then they'll take the next step. Paul, you talked to AP this week, and you discussed with the Associated Press how advocates going forward might need to pivot some of their strategies and messagings. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. In some ways, we've almost become victims of our own success. And what I mean by that is, again, as I mentioned earlier, in 12 years, we went from 0 adult use legal states to 24. That leaves 26 states on the table. Now, in 14 of the 24 states where adult use marijuana is legal, those measures passed via a direct citizens ballot initiative. In the other 10 states, it was done legislatively. But in 14, or the majority of those states where marijuana is legal right now, it was done via the citizens initiative process. So we've been very successful historically using that medium as a way to bring about direct reform. The problem is that I think we're at a point where there's going to be some diminishing returns with the ballot initiative process. And we just saw some of that. We were just witness to some of that on election day, because not every state allows for citizen initiatives. In fact, only about 23 or 24 states do. So when we look at those remaining 26 states, many of them don't allow the citizens initiative process at all. And for many of those handful that do, that process is actually much more complicated than it might otherwise be. We just saw this. Florida allows for citizens-initiated ballot initiatives, but you need 60%, not 50. That makes Florida a very difficult state to win a ballot initiative. Utah, for instance, has a ballot initiative process, but the outcome of that process isn't necessarily binding. Lawmakers in Utah can repeal a measure that's passed by a ballot initiative. So again, you have to weigh the pros and cons. Is it worth trying to run a campaign in Utah, which is going to be very difficult to win in the first place? And even if you do win, there's no guarantee lawmakers aren't going to simply repeal the law anyway, because they can, because that's the way it works there. Idaho has an initiative process, but arguably there's probably lower support in Idaho than almost any other state in this country, other than maybe Wyoming, which also allows for initiative process. So again, when we sort of just look at the map, it's not as simple as saying, well, let's just target the last few states where there's still initiatives, because there's reasons that make those states not necessarily palatable. So if we're looking at some of those states, we're probably looking at different tactics. We're probably looking at trying to enact changes legislatively, which of course brings its own set of unique hurdles, particularly in some of these GOP-dominated states where you have a governor, a House, and a Senate that's all led by Republicans who don't have much of an appetite for moving this issue forward. So when I talk to AP about changing tactics, yeah, again, if we want to create reforms in those 26 states, we're likely going to have to do so the old-fashioned way by convincing the legislature for change. And we're likely going to have to set some of the initial goals to be somewhat lower than we might elsewhere. We might have to settle in a state like Wyoming or even Pennsylvania, frankly, for decriminalization statewide first, and then move on to build gains upon that. But the path forward is going to be more difficult in some of these remaining states. That's just a fact. And again, it's going to require our movement and our advocates, and particularly those on the ground in some of these jurisdictions, to really be trying new strategies to see what works. Because the arguments that may have worked in New York State or may work in California aren't necessarily going to work in Texas and Alabama. That's just the way politics are.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And so we've got a couple of things. I'm watching the comments here. We've got a couple of things going on. We got a lot of chatter about Florida happening. I know we touched on it a little bit, but I think it's also, someone asked a question about, or someone said, why they didn't like the Florida initiative. It wasn't, I'm summarizing, but for them it didn't do enough. Well, it couldn't. Can only do so many things.
Yeah, that's actually something else I didn't mention. But when we talk about these states, the less than half state, the less than 50% of states that have the initiative process, that initiative process isn't the same in every state. And Florida is a state that says, well, you can put an initiative on the ballot, but that initiative has to be focused on a single subject. And the court has very narrowly made determinations in the past as to what a single subject is as it applies to marijuana policy reform. There had been 2 or 3 prior initiatives where the language had been submitted in Florida to the Secretary of State's office that tried to encompass a broader number of issues surrounding marijuana legalization, and the court struck them down. They said they violated the single subject law. There's subjectivity to that, of course, but those were the rulings that existed previously, and it was because of those rulings that this particular initiative was written in such a narrow fashion. That's not unique to Florida. We saw in Nebraska in this last go-around that their medical marijuana access initiative had to be split into 2 separate initiatives. One asking voters if they thought patients should be able to legally possess marijuana, and a separate initiative asking voters if they thought the state should regulate the distribution of medical marijuana, because the courts had previously in that state said those are 2 separate issues and couldn't be combined on the ballot in one ballot question.
Yeah, so there's the answer if that person is still watching on Instagram. Listen, you're right, it didn't include the allowance for personal cultivation, and there's a reason why it didn't. At the end of the day, though, elections, whether they're on statewide ballot measures or for the people who represent you, those elections have consequences, and you're feeling that in Florida right now. You're feeling that in a lot of states right now.
Yeah, and
Remember
I'll say this about Florida, as narrowly written as that initiative was, and how it was lacking a number of provisions that we tend to expect to see in these initiatives, it still gained 1.2 million more votes than it lost. You know, over 1.2 million people, more people said yes to Amendment 3 than said no to it. And
Mhm.
if we had a functioning, healthy democracy, lawmakers in Florida would simply see that as a mandate. They'd say, look, this is clearly an issue that's very popular with the voters, and we as lawmakers have a responsibility to speak for those voters. And they would head to Tallahassee next year and they would craft legislation to bring about a comprehensive state legal regulated market that also allowed for home cultivation. Unfortunately, that's not the way lawmakers think in Florida. And we've already heard from Republican leadership of the House and the Senate saying that they don't see any mandate in Florida at all, that they have no intention of addressing these issues at all in Tallahassee. And in fact, they even said that that initiative likely got 56% because the voters were confused. Because they said it made no sense that Florida voters would re-elect Republicans into Tallahassee who oppose legalization and also approve a legalization ballot measure. So unfortunately for those folks who perhaps voted against Amendment 3 because they didn't think it did enough and hoped that maybe it would send a message to Tallahassee that they need to pick up the ball, Tallahassee didn't get that message from that election result.
No, and congratulations, Florida. You get 60,000 more marijuana arrests or continued annually in your state. Like that was the choice. The choice wasn't, do I get a perfect business model that suits my needs? The choice was, do we keep arresting people or do we stop?
Yeah, yeah.
So,
And again, this is something, I used to tell people that, winning a campaign like this or winning an initiative like this, people act like that's the end. And I would say, no, that's the starting point, because it's only in an environment where marijuana is no longer considered to be contraband, or it's no longer considered to be illicit activity, that we can finally bring all the stakeholders together in the room together and hash out what a responsible, sensible marijuana legalization policy looks like. And in any state where we look, where legalization has passed, whether it's medical marijuana legalization or adult use legalization, none of those laws are static. None of them are locked in. The lawmakers go back every single legislative session and they tweak those policies, generally employing better practices as they become more comfortable with legalization and as they learn from the experiences in other states. And that's not a surprise. The federal government repealed alcohol prohibition nearly a century ago, and states are still tweaking how they deal with the regulation of alcohol. The state I grew up in 20, 30 years ago, you couldn't buy alcohol on Sundays. They didn't allow it. Now they do. Couldn't buy alcohol on holidays. They didn't allow it. Now they do. You couldn't buy beer where you buy liquor or where you buy wine. They still keep that prohibition in place, But again, we've seen the rules surrounding alcohol change over time. It wasn't long ago, certain states like Oklahoma and Texas required the sale of 3.2 beer or lower alcohol content beer. They don't do that anymore. So this is constantly going to be an issue that is going to be tweaked along the way. And whatever legislation is initially passed or whatever ballot language initially becomes law, it is always going to evolve, arguably for the better going forward.
let's hope. Um, we talked about the Gallup poll a little bit earlier, but I think it bears repeating. The most recent Gallup poll shows that nearly 70% of adults say that marijuana ought to be legal, which is a near historic high. What do you think this means going forward?
Yeah, it means that people's takeaway from their real world experience with legalization is a success. Again, people talk about the Gallup poll because it has been the one pollster that's been asking this question the longest. And if you go back to 1969, fewer than 10% of Americans supported legalization. But to me, the most important information to be gleaned from the Gallup poll is what's happened since 2012. Because in 2012, the first two states, Colorado and Washington, legalized marijuana for adults. Nationwide support for legalization wasn't even at a majority. It was 48% in 2012. Now, as you just mentioned, it's 68%. We've seen a 20% jump in support for legalization over the same period of time that we went from 0 legal states to 24 legal states. Again, we see rising public support for legalization in parallel with more and more states legalizing. This is why, at the end of the day, I still do not feel like our political opponents will ever gain any traction on this issue. Because they claimed at the time, and they continue to claim, that when Americans see legalization up close, they're really not going to like it. They're going to discover they've been lied to about it and that there's all these unintended consequences, and they're going to hate it. And the polling data shows just the opposite. They show the more Americans become familiar with legalization, the more they like it, and the more they don't like prohibition and criminalization. And that's why, again, I don't feel like our opponents have ever tried to run a campaign to repeal any of these policies. They know they don't have the support, and our trajectory is continuing to move forward because, again, the more people experience legalization, the more they like it. That's why ultimately we're going to win this.
Hey, remember when John McCain, we saw John McCain on the Hill, and that's exactly what he said. He pointed at us and he said, "You're winning." Yes, indeed. Actually, he saw the pot leaf pin on my colleague's lapel and said, "What's that about?" Then explained, and then he said, "Oh, you're winning." And that was
many years ago, I did his daughter's podcast, and we spoke privately off air, and she was very, very supportive of legalization at that time. And this was many, many years ago. Certainly but I don't think her father ever publicly became particularly supportive of legalization, but his daughter certainly was.
That's fascinating. All right. We're going to talk about rescheduling and descheduling. Before we get into that, I've seen some comments, and so I just want to make it real clear for those of you who may not know. NORML is a nonpartisan organization. We're going to say Republican and Democrat because that's the reality. And when one party does something that's not great, and we say that, it's just telling you what's happening. It's not a political endorsement. It's not, being one-sided or partisan. It's just the reality. So buckle up. We're gonna get into it. Okay, so what are the latest developments regarding the rescheduling process and the upcoming DEA hearing?
Yeah, so the latest kind of developments I find from a sort of wonky insider perspective to be fairly interesting. So, as many folks listening probably already know, a couple months ago, the DEA set a date to commence hearings on the proposed rule to move marijuana out of Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act and move it to Schedule 3. That was a rule that was initially proposed based on recommendations from the Department of Health and Human Services. Now, that December 2nd date is theoretically when the hearing was going to commence. I told anyone who would listen, in-person hearings were certainly not going to commence on that date. There would still be all sorts of legal maneuvering that would take place before that. And that's what's happening. So a couple of weeks ago, the DEA did appoint an administrative judge to oversee the hearing. I cannot stress to folks listening how much power the judge has over this hearing. The judge selects which parties have standing to participate in the hearing, either by submitting written affidavits or by participating in person. The judge also determines what topics those participants can even discuss. So who's going to take part in this hearing and what the parameters are of this hearing are all determined by the judge who is selected. Now, the judge did something very interesting. Once he was selected, he was provided a list of 25 parties that the DEA, the agency, had determined had standing and qualifications to participate in this hearing. And apparently all he was given was a list of names. There was no further background information. According to the judge, he didn't even know if these parties, if they were pro or against the idea of rescheduling. He was just given a list of names. He had no idea why they were selected or what criteria the DEA used. Now that matters because in this particular hearing, there is clear regulatory language that defines whether or not a party has standing to participate or not. So the first thing the judge did was take this list of 25 names and contact all 25 of them. And he said, look, I need to know where you stand on this issue, and I need to know how you think you meet the regulatory requirements for standing. And he gave them a deadline of Tuesday of this week to submit that paperwork. I presume most of those parties did, although we do know that one of the 25 already dropped out. And I presume took that order to mean or to think they probably wouldn't meet the criteria of standing. So they didn't even try. We won't know until we get closer to December 2nd if those other 24 parties are actually going to meet the judge's determination of standing. He may toss a number of these people off the docket and say, look, I just don't think you meet these hurdles here. You're not going to participate in this hearing. He may tell some that they can participate in person. He may tell others he only wants to see their written testimony. Again, a lot of decisions are going to be made before December 2nd. But from that point forward, we should have a pretty good idea who the witnesses are going to be, what they're going to say, and when they're going to say it, because all of those factors are determined ahead of time by the judge. And I will acknowledge for folks listening who may not know, NORML was among the groups that sent a notification saying we wanted to participate. We argued why we felt we had standing and should be there. I specifically argued to be a witness in that case, but we were not among those that were chosen by the DEA. And again, because the DEA provided no rational basis for who they chose and who they rejected, we really have no idea why we weren't chosen.
Well, I like to think it's because we've agreed with the proposals in this rescheduling effort so far, but who knows?
So yeah, for folks sort of trying to put a timeline on when in-person hearing, when the in-person portion of this hearing may begin, it won't be sooner than mid-January, and very likely it probably won't be till late January, early February. That was the rough timeline the judge was giving participants to provide him with dates as to when they thought they would be able to appear. But I also want to make clear to folks, you know, if and when the in-person testimony starts, don't necessarily think the DEA or the judge is going to allot, you know, say 4 days in the third week in February, and that's going to be the beginning, middle, and end of the hearing. If you go back to the ALJ hearing in 1986, the only real prior example we have of a marijuana rescheduling hearing, from beginning to end, that process took about 2 years. And I'm just talking about the hearing. there were about 4 or 5 specific dates that were set for in-person testimony, but there were gaps of several months in between those dates. And that's why that's one of the reasons why the hearing dragged out so long. Then when the final testimony is taken and final arguments are made, at that point, the judge does not have a set time limit when to issue a ruling, but we'd probably expect one within about 30 or 60 days. I should add this too, though. The ALJ judge's ruling is not the final determination in this case. The DEA as an agency has the legal authority, if they wish to overrule the judge's ruling. So you could theoretically have a scenario. I'm not saying we will, but we could have a scenario where we go through this entire hearing. The judge agrees that marijuana ought to be rescheduled, agrees with the proposed rule, and the DEA as an agency still says no. And they have the authority to do that if they wish to.
Well, I see there's a thread of comments here that touch on what you just mentioned. And it starts
I agree with the one that says Carl Hart for drug czar.
I'm getting to that one. But anyhow, it starts with Brady's comment about being petrified that the Trump administration is going to nix all rescheduling and reform efforts. And so I do want to talk about that. I want to give the biggest shout out to Edward for nominating Carl for drug czar. But I don't think that's what's going to happen, my friend, by any measure, because we've seen some appointments already. And I think Paul's going to have some thoughts on, I think we're all going to have some thoughts on those, but I think we're going to put Paul up to share his thoughts with us. And we did have another comment earlier in the show, specifically asking about RFK, but I think we should talk about Matt Gaetz as well. And what do these appointments mean?
So, I'm not a big prognosticator. I don't like spending a whole lot of energy on things that might happen, because there's so many things that are in fact happening that I think should take priority. Look, Matt Gaetz has a long record being a very outspoken proponent of marijuana policy reform at the federal level. The question is whether he will be confirmed as Attorney General. And we don't know the answer to that. I think he is a bit of a lightning rod within his own party. And it's very possible if he goes through a traditional confirmation process, he will not be confirmed. Others have said, well, Trump may bypass the entire confirmation process altogether by doing recess appointments. I'm not of the opinion Senate leadership is going to essentially abdicate their responsibility as a separate but equal branch of government and let Trump do that. So again, the question is really unknown. And that goes for the RFK appointment as well. Those are two very controversial appointments in various circles. And I'm not sure whether either get through a traditional confirmation process. If and when they do, then I think we can sit down and have a conversation about what those individuals in those positions may mean. But, at this point, I think it's premature. I will say this as a general statement is I am fairly confident that the administrative rescheduling process will move forward in a Trump administration. I don't think that there is political capital within the administration right now to disrupt it. If anything, I think there's probably some support within some close Trump allies like Gabbard, like RFK, like Gaetz, that have every reason to see it move expeditiously and reach a conclusion. So I'm not particularly concerned about that.
Well, that's good to hear. I hope that makes you feel better, Brady. I haven't seen any other questions about appointments or the effect of the incoming administration on rescheduling. We talked about some state impacts earlier.
I do think it's worth mentioning that the elevation of South Dakota Senator John Thune to be the Senate Majority Leader certainly has implications for marijuana policy
That
or
was
prospects of marijuana policy at the federal level.
Let's get into that because I did have that in the news section. But let's bring it right up. Let's bring it right up now. You wrote about that this week.
Yeah. So obviously, the Senate Majority Leader wields a lot of power in that chamber. That person has the ability to set the agenda and determine what issues come to the floor for a vote, whether a vote's held at all. This senator has a long history of being strongly against really any federal marijuana reforms that have been on the table. He's criticized efforts to amend banking reform. He has called state level legalization a mistake. He was one of 26 Republicans who signed onto a letter this summer saying that it was inappropriate for the administration to be moving forward with rescheduling and that marijuana should stay in Schedule 1. So this is not somebody I see as being an ally in that chamber or having any appetite to really move legislation forward in that chamber. As far as the House goes, I think we already know the answer to this. We've seen what the last 2 years of a House of Representatives led by Mike Johnson looks like for marijuana policy reform. And the answer is a big nothing burger. While there was a whole lot of focus on whether safer banking would move in the Senate, I still hear talk about, well, maybe it could move in the Senate in the lame duck session. None of this chatter seems to recognize the fact that there's a safe banking bill in the House that has over 100 co-sponsors that's never even gotten a hearing under Republican leadership, and it's not going to.
I thought that Thune's, well, the letter, not necessarily his in particular, but they're like just being completely wedded to that flat earth position that marijuana has no accepted medical use.
Yes, they say that right in the letter. Yes.
In response to the federal government recognizing that cannabis has medical utility, they still turned around and said, no, it doesn't.
Well, what's so ironic is, the person who ghostwrote that letter is the same person that for years said, hey, we don't determine medicine by public vote. We determine medicine by listening to the FDA. And the FDA was among the federal agencies that made the recommendation that marijuana needs to be moved from Schedule 1 because it is a medicine. And now that same person is ghostwriting letters for these GOP lawmakers, maintaining that flat earth position and trying to say, oh, no, it's still not a medicine. Doesn't matter what the FDA says.
Look, okay, Ben, we're gonna show Ben's comment. Ben says, okay, but listen, Republicans were obstructing in the 118th, but now they have trifecta power in the 119th. Seize the moment. What's the moment though?
Yeah, I'm not sure what we're seizing. I mean, again, you can make the argument that perhaps there's an opportunity in the lame duck session to move something through the Senate while there's still a Democratic Senate majority, but that doesn't mean you're going to be able to move it through a GOP-led majority in the House. And the other thing I'd simply note is that, look, there's this thing known as a budget that Congress refuses to pass. And in lieu of passing a budget, they pass these short-term continuing resolutions every few months. And the current one is set to expire shortly. And that's what Congress, during the lame duck, that is going to be their first priority, is passing yet another CR to keep the government open into 2025.
Well, this is going to be quite a time for cannabis policy once again, and it's like you and I were talking about last week. It's almost like turning back the clock a bit when it comes to the focus of advocacy work and what it means. And if your state doesn't have meaningful reform, it seems like now you're a lot less likely to get it, either because your state is not one with a ballot initiative process, or you have a legislature that is very conservative and might feel emboldened to take even less action now. But there's always room to do something, and those unsexy bills that deal with minor medical improvements very well may be the path forward. And as you were mentioning earlier, statewide decriminalization in some of those perhaps more moderate states that haven't yet crossed that bridge.
Yeah, and the reason I highlighted that, and I think I mentioned for Texas, is because Texas is an example of a state where a number of cities in that state, Austin, Houston, Dallas, some of these major urban areas that are very dense in population, they've already decriminalized or depenalized marijuana in those cities, in those municipalities. So even though there's this statewide criminalization, in the parts of the state where most people live, the marijuana policy, the local policy is different. It's one of the reasons we've seen significant declines in arrests in recent years in states like Texas, also to some degree in states like Florida, because even though the legislature refuses to move on this issue, local lawmakers are moving on this issue. Florida is an even better example because there's nearly 24 cities now in Florida, including Miami, and some of the Tallahassee, some of the largest cities in Florida, where again, marijuana has been decriminalized on the local level. We see this in Wisconsin. We see this in a number of prohibition states. We see this in Pennsylvania. So given the fact that significant portions of the electorate in these states are already living under these policies, I think there's more leverage and perhaps more comfort among state lawmakers to expand these policies in those jurisdictions and make them statewide, as opposed to this patchwork city to city policy.
Well, hopefully that is something that will resonate with lawmakers at the state level in the next General Assembly, or if not, the subsequent one. Joseph, thank you for this question. How can we buy merchandise to support NORML? You can just go to the NORML store, and you can find so much merchandise, including our new 2024 holiday ornaments that just went up yesterday. You'll find them on the front page. It's store.norml.org, or just go to the NORML front page and you'll see it right there. There's a something somewhere. I'll put that in the comments, Joseph. So you should get that link in the comments, and there it is. That's where you go. Enjoy our new holiday offerings. Let's get into a little bit of news, Paul.
Okay, real quick, someone asked, someone said they thought lame duck. Oh, I lost it now, but he said, I thought lame duck meant no one has a majority. That's actually not what it means. The lame duck simply refers to the period of time post-election, but before the new administration has come in. And usually Congress meets for a couple weeks in October and a couple weeks in November during that period of time, before there's been any shakeup in either the House or the Senate, and before the new administrations come in.
Yeah, or sometimes at the state level, they'll use lame duck to refer to the last legislative session over which a governor can preside. Like in 2025, it will be a lame duck session for, I forgot his name for a hot second there. I wish it would stay out of my brain, but Governor Youngkin won't get much accomplished in the 2025 session.
Yes, but on to news.
On to news. Where's the NORML store located? On the internets. It's located on the internets. We have a company that fulfills our orders for us in Texas, but it's not like a physical store. All right, back onto the news. You wrote earlier today about a just published Danish study looking at lifetime cannabis use and IQ. So tell us what that's about.
Sure. So a lot of studies have been published over the years looking to see if there's any relationship between marijuana use and IQ. And the overwhelming majority of these studies actually find no association between marijuana use and lower IQ, regardless of how much marijuana one uses and regardless of when they begin to initiate their use. Now, you might not know that because there is one glaring exception. There's a study that was published in 2012 by a researcher and her team at Duke University. That researcher's name is Madeline Meyer. And they looked at a cohort of people in New Zealand. And they looked at IQ rates when these individuals were in their mid to late teens, and then they looked at IQ rates when they were in their mid 30s. And what they found was an association between those people in the cohort who had the earliest exposure, the youngest age exposure to cannabis. And they found that in those folks, by the mid 30s, they had slightly lower IQ, was a 6-point difference, than individuals who had no exposure to cannabis. You would think this is the only study that exists on this subject because it's usually the only one that's ever referenced. And it's why we see mainstream media and other pundits consistently say marijuana is linked to lower IQ in midlife. Regardless of the fact that we have so many other studies, including studies looking at twins, where one twin used cannabis early in life, the other twin didn't. We look at their IQs later in life, we don't find any difference associated with marijuana use, despite the fact that Madeline Meyer in her own follow-up research wasn't able to replicate those results, despite the fact that the very journal that published that study in 2012 published another paper, literally weeks later, critiquing the Duke University study and saying that the authors failed to account for confounding variables, including socioeconomic differences. And when you address that methodological issue, the difference in IQ went down to 0. Despite all those things, we continue to hear marijuana leads to IQ loss. Well, this week, a paper was published out of Denmark that actually came about as close to replicating the 2012 model as we have, because they have conscription in Denmark. So when men are between the ages of 18 and 22, they have to volunteer for service. And as part of that process, they're given a battery of cognitive tests and their IQ is tested. And so these researchers had data going back 4 decades on men ages 18 to 22 on their cognitive performance and their IQ and their marijuana use history. And so they took this cohort of about 5,100 people and they tracked them all down 44 years later. And they ran them through the same battery of tests. And they continued to ask these people, well, you were using marijuana when you were tested when you were 18, if you continued to use marijuana throughout your life, who hadn't. And what they found was that the individuals who had a cannabis use history throughout this lifetime, their IQ points, their age-related cognitive IQ dropped about 1.3 points over the 44-year period. But individuals that had no experience and exposure to marijuana, on average, their IQ dropped 6 points over that 44-year period. So what they found was that marijuana had no negative impact on age-related drop in IQ. And in fact, it may have had some protective effect based on the fact of the people that had the marijuana use history did not have as significant a drop in IQ over the 4-decade period as the people with no marijuana use history. And again, when they talked about marijuana use history, they saw no negative effect regardless of when these people first initiated their use or how frequent or heavy their use was for the rest of their lifetime. That is a stark rebuttal to the 2012 Madeline Meyer paper and those findings, which again had really been rebutted by numerous studies over the years. But this study was really definitively responding to that. And so again, that claim, even though it may be prominent and longstanding, it's really not legitimate. And as I said in a press release we put out to media today, what's really unfortunate, the reason these sort of stereotypes persist is because they often go unchallenged in the mainstream media. And more importantly, because when scientific studies come out rebutting these stereotypes, they're all too often ignored. And I really hope that doesn't happen to this study.
I think we'll know soon enough, won't we?
Yeah, absolutely.
Paul, it's been great having you on the show today. If anyone has any questions before Paul says goodbye, now's the time to get those in. I did see Lori G in Brooklyn says that Danish study is statistically significant. Yeah, we got a lot of positive comments happening right now. Here, let's take a look at this one, Paul, and then you can peace out. So I've seen Ben making some comments and Deschedule Now making some comments about what to do. Deschedule Now says to amend the Prepare Act as a continuing resolution rider, include addressing cannabis caucus issues, losing immediate members, and suggest possible committee hearings and possible congressional cannabis commission.
Yeah, unfortunately, when members of Congress wait till the last minute to keep the government open, which is typically what they do, and they revert to passing a CR, they literally just take the language that is already in place from the last CR and extend it. They don't have any appetite in actually going in and expanding or amending language in the CR. This is usually done as again, a last minute stopgap measure, literally just to keep the government open until the next time funding's about to run out and they do it again.
Well, I'm glad we talked about their question. I didn't want them to think that we were overlooking that. And again, we have talked about this so many times on this show, but this rescheduling process is specifically about that. It is about rescheduling. This is not an either or scenario. In the rescheduling process, it is about moving from 1 to 3. It is not about descheduling. That is not on the table in that process. Descheduling is entirely separate, and you can have both at the same time, kids. You don't have to pick and choose. It's okay. Right?
Absolutely. Almost all the federal bills specific to marijuana law reform include descheduling. None of them talk about rescheduling. They all talk about descheduling. And obviously, those bills can coexist and move forward at the very same time this administrative process is considering rescheduling.
Because at the end of the day, it is an act of Congress that is required to remove marijuana from the Federal Controlled Substances Act and allow states to set their own policies without threat of federal interference. So if that's actually a priority for you folks, I hope it is. But remember that when you're electing people to Congress, and if you're electing people who have been obstructionist or who have been prohibitionist in their rhetoric around cannabis policy, perhaps that's not the best way to meet your goal of descheduling.
Absolutely. As you say, JM, if you elect politicians who are bad on marijuana policy, what do you get?
Bad marijuana policy.
Exactly.
Thanks, Sherry, for my sign. It's actually art, but I use it as a sign. Paul, thanks so much for joining us. I'll let you get out of here and enjoy your Friday. I'm gonna tell our friends about where else they can find us and connect with us and all those good things. But hey, everyone, let's say thanks to Paul.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, JM. Enjoy the rest of the show and your weekend.
All right, thanks, you too. All right, everyone. If you have any last-minute burning questions, drop them in the comments, and I will do my best to get those to you. John, I will tell Paul that you said Happy Thanksgiving. He's probably still listening right now. Hey, Lori, thanks for your questions. I really appreciate those. Thank you, Melissa, for helping out in the comments. Definitely appreciate that. I hope that deschedule now. I hope those comments were helpful for you. Yeah. Okay. So listen, if you have not yet subscribed to Normal News, you could be getting these stories in your inbox every Thursday and Saturday. There's still time for you to get the Saturday edition because it's only Friday. But head to normal.org/subscribe. Make sure you check the weekend read box so you always get that delivered to you on Saturdays as well. And we'll have all these stories that we talked about and more delivering about 9 a.m. Eastern on Saturdays. And then next week, Thursdays, is when Normal News of the Week comes out. That comes out around 4:20 p.m. Eastern because we've got jokes. So check that out, normal.org/subscribe. Let me tell you about a few more things coming up. No, Dr. Lieb, no. I will not be at MJ BizCon because I will be in Key West. I will be, we're in the event section, so why not? I will be in Key West with Paul and Keith for the 2024 NORML Key West Legal Seminar, December 5 through 7th at the Pure House Resort and Spa. You can get full details at normal.org/Key West. If you are an attorney who needs CLEs, NORML legal seminars are fully accredited in every state that requires continuing legal education credits for their practicing attorneys. Now, if you are not an attorney or you just don't need those CLEs, the good news, we have a discounted rate for you. So whether you're an attorney or not, this conference is a great opportunity for you to connect with legal experts around the country who we can all lean on when we are working our way from marijuana prohibition to cannabis freedom. I'd love to see you in Key West, so register normal.org/Key West. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Ben. Appreciate it. Coming up tomorrow, no, Sunday. I don't know how days of the week work. Okay, on Sundays, our Florida chapter, Suncoast NORML, hosts The Rotation. You can live stream this on YouTube at Suncoast NORML. This is Sundays at 11 a.m. Eastern. And I think that you can listen to it afterward as well. Coming up in January is I can hardly say this. Did I have the wrong dates? 26, 27. Oh no, that's what it was. Okay, watch me count. The 2025 Virginia Cannabis Conference, January 24th, 25th, and 26th in Richmond, Virginia. You can find out full details at virginiacannabisconference.com. Tickets are on sale now. And then on the 27th of January, Virginia NORML will host its Lobby Day. This is a free event, but we do encourage everyone to register in advance so that we can hopefully get appointments for you with your lawmakers. So fill out the form. You can also find that on the Virginia Cannabis Conference website at virginiacannabisconference.com. Just click Lobby Day. And yes, if you're not from Virginia, you're welcome to come. There will be information that is not specific to Virginia that you can certainly benefit from, whatever state you're in. Politico 420, I really appreciated your comments on Instagram. Thank you. I can tell you NORML is ready to see what shakes out in Nebraska for sure. That was just, those results were so fantastic, and we're hoping that the judge rules in favor of the measure. It's a plural. Whew. All right, those are all of our events. We did all the news. Let me give you the link in case you want to subscribe to the Weekend Weed Read. You do. That's in the chat for, sorry, everyone except for Instagram. Can't give you those links on Instagram. I mean, we could, but you can't click them. Yeah. Okay. That's it. We did it. We did that. We did all the things. Hey, if you're watching this show afterward, we love to answer your questions. You can send those to us at normal@normal.org. If you have one specific to me, you can send it there. I'll see it. You can send it to chapters@normal.org. I'll see it there as well. Send us your questions, and we'd love to help you get involved in changing cannabis policy wherever you are, whether it's the US or not. We have a lot of tools and resources available to help you change cannabis laws. All right, friends, this has been a blast. I love hanging out with you all on Friday afternoons. So let's do it again next week. Make sure you hit that like, follow, or subscribe button wherever you're watching so you never miss when NORML goes live. Thanks so much for joining us. I hope you have a fantastic weekend. And as always, I'll see you back here next time. Bye-bye.